how is the United States going to pay off this foreign debt? That's everyone's biggest concern. Because if this debt can't be paid, or if it keeps growing, it could collapse the American economy and therefore the US dollar, US Treasury bonds, and the entire world economy. The capitalists say that America will handle this. They can't get out of this mess. It's possible, but America has some plans. It tried one plan before. That one didn't really work. Now they have a new plan, and this new plan will especially affect crypto investors and also AI investors. I detailed this at the start of yesterday's live stream. Live streams are long and explanations aren't always clear there, so I structured it better and made it shorter. I'll show you now. How will America solve its debt? And what role will cryptocurrencies play in all this? Why are Bitcoin, Ethereum, and XRP likely to have really good days ahead in the medium to long term? If you're ready, let's get started. First, let's define America's problem. Gross national. Compared to its GNP, debt has risen dramatically, topping 150%. This year, debt interest will surpass healthcare spending and likely defense spending next. This is a critical threshold for any country. America must solve this. Before Trump's election, he strategized and tested it early on. So what was the attempt? Let's cut expenses. In other words, if the American government reduces budget deficits, the need for borrowing will decrease over time. This would especially lower the interest rates on long-term American Treasury bonds. That way, we could borrow at lower interest rates and also reduce the need for borrowing overall. On the other hand, if we could close the budget deficit a bit more and bring some extra money into the government through tariffs, we could solve this problem over time. That was the basic strategy. But unfortunately, this strategy didn't work. Donald Trump had put Elon Musk in charge of the dock to cut expenses. That didn't work out. There was a lot of pushback, both from citizens and politicians. In fact, there was a huge wave of hostility against Elon Musk. Elon Musk's stores were set on fire, Teslas were burned. Crazy things happen. Trump found cutting costs difficult as it hits many interests. Musk saw this and quit anyway. Then, as you know, they fought with Trump. But the problem is still there. So what kind of solution could there be? Here's the new solution. Since we can't cut expenses, since we can't reduce the debt either, then let's grow merit debt. This keeps debt below the GNP, bringing today's 150% ratio to 100%, even if the debts don't decrease. In fact, even if they go up a little, I'll create such economic growth that I'll solve this problem. It's basically the idea. That's why America needs to grow its economy. And not just a little, it needs to grow a lot. But while growing the economy, they also can't let inflation get out of control. Because if you let inflation get out of hand, then the Federal Reserve steps in. They raise interest rates and growth comes to a halt. There's nothing else piling on top of all this. There's one more problem. They also need to roll over their debt. And when rolling over the debt, they don't want to pay very high interest rates. Because as I just mentioned, even right now, interest rates are taking a serious chunk out of the economy. And interest rates are high right now. If you remember, they tried to focus on the long-term side to bring down interest rates, really working to lower the 10-year yields. That didn't work out because the markets weren't convinced that America's spending would decrease. And the big Treasury bonds? Investors didn't support the project either. Instead, 10-year bond yields rose, hitting nearly 5%. A solution is needed. The economy will grow, inflation won't spiral, debts will stay manageable, and rates will fall. What could that solution be? Well, that solution involves cryptocurrencies. The first leg of the plan is to focus on short-term borrowing. They couldn't get what they wanted from long-term borrowing. Because in long-term bonds, the market sets the interest rate. But in short-term bonds, the Fed has a lot of influence because, as you know, the Fed directly influences overnight rates and becomes the main determinant of short-term interest rates. So they said, let's not get involved with long-term bonds. Let's focus on short-term ones. In fact, the employment data that came out yesterday was really strange. Missing expectations, they erased 258,000 jobs. Last month's 140,000 jobs were later revised to just 14,000. That's why the market crashed. But as the market crashed, something else also dropped. Short-term Treasury yields. Look, the 2-year yields fell by 6.25%, and they dropped to the 3.7 level. For the 1-year notes, the drop was 5.99. They fell to the 3.874 level. When it comes to why people prefer these short-term Treasury notes, it's not just about Powell and the Federal Reserve. We'll get to that in a bit. There's another issue too. Stablecoins, because stablecoins take the money they get from you and invest it in U.S. Treasury notes. The Genius Act, which passed in Congress last week, established all the regulations on this issue. Now, this process is operating legally. For example, when you buy $1 of Tether, you're actually buying $1 of U.S. Treasury notes. On this side, they're trying to create serious demand for these short-term U.S. Treasury notes. Even right now, if I'm not mistaken, around $250 billion is flowing directly from stablecoins into Treasury notes. They're going to increase demand here a bit more by making the stablecoin market more and more exciting, by bringing excitement there. I'll explain how they're going to do that in a bit. This is one. This forms one leg of it. They say if we can generate a lot of demand for 1 year and 2 year Treasury notes, as demand for these increases from stablecoins, their interest rates will drop. You know, with Treasury notes, demand and interest rates work inversely. That's one leg of the plan. The second leg is the pressure being put on Powell. Trump should be happy about the employment data from yesterday. Powell's in a tough spot. This could even be a conspiracy. Trump planned this. But now Trump brings out that bad employment data, he's firing people. I think he wants to manage employment data even more directly in the future. Because if employment deteriorates, Powell will have to cut interest rates. They're putting pressure from this angle. On the one hand, you know, he's literally counting and cursing at Powell. He's trying to crush him from that side. He's sending inspectors after him. He says to him, "You spent way too much money on renovating the central bank buildings," he says. On the other hand, they're already preparing to announce who the alternative central bank president will be, just to put more pressure on Powell, and the markets will lower interest rates. They want to make sure that a president will come in there. And don't forget, something happened in this week's announced Fed interest rate decision that you rarely see in history. 2 Fed members objected to keeping the rates unchanged. Those 2 Fed members are also Trump's friends, people Trump appointed there. By the way, there's some news that came out over the weekend. Another Fed official has resigned. Trump will also appoint a replacement. That resignation is intriguing. To sum it all up, if necessary, they're putting an incredible amount of pressure on 1 year and 2 year Treasury bonds here. On one hand, they're creating demand so that the yields on these go down. On the other hand, they're giving Powell a hard time. All right, up to this point, that's all good. But how are they going to increase demand for stablecoins? Isn't that something that's only possible by increasing demand on the crypto side? It's very simple. Because what do? First, we buy stablecoins and then convert them into crypto. At least that's how most of us do it. And at the same time, there needs to be more things you can do with stablecoins. I mean, we shouldn't just use stablecoins to buy cryptocurrency. You should be able to do other things with them too. For example, tokenizing stocks, breaking them down into coins and buying or selling them. Regulations around these things are developing really quickly right now. In some cases, companies like Robinhood are doing these things even before regulations are in place. And the government is turning a blind eye because the government says, I need to increase demand for stablecoins so that in turn, demand for bonds will also rise. The way to boost demand for stablecoins is related to this, solving the legal problems. That's what the Genius Act did. They solved all the legal issues, and at the same time, they're working to increase demand for cryptocurrencies. If we increase the number of things that can be done with stablecoins and can convince people to invest in cryptocurrencies, there'll be even more demand here. Today, Donald Trump's son tweeted again. He said to buy the dip in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Of course, this also helps you get richer personally. But let's not get into that. Let's focus here on their patriotic side for now. And the Secretary of the Treasury is also giving serious support to this project. Yesterday, in a tweet, the Treasury Secretary said that the United States is entering the crypto golden age. Various regulations are also coming one after another. Remember, the previous chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission was our adversary. But the current chairman has prepared a new regulation that's about 150 to 160 pages long, is submitting it for approval, and is introducing a lot of new rules for cryptocurrencies. We'll talk about the details of that regulation later. The main thing you need to understand is that they're making it more attractive to hold cryptocurrencies. They're also introducing some regulations for cryptocurrency exchanges, because as you know, with all these liquidations happening all the time, they open a bunch of futures positions and then end up bankrupting investors. Let's put a stop to this. That way, the crypto world can become a bit more stable. With this stabilization, the demand for cryptocurrencies will increase. Is everything clear up to this point? We're doing well so far, right? But they're not stopping there. They say, okay, we sold the Azizli bond. That's a good thing. This way, we reduce the interest on our bad. Debts were rolled over, but that won't spark growth. How do we grow it? We need to inject money into the market. But they're having a hard time putting money into the market because the U.S. Federal Reserve is still tightening the money. So what solution did they come up with? This is also a very clever solution. Roughly speaking, American banks, that is, private banks, hold about $3.6 to $3.7 trillion in cash. Actually, this money was given to them by the U.S. Federal Reserve. These are deposits, in other words, reserves. The banks can't release these reserves into the market. How does a bank inject money into the market? By lending it out. They can't do it because there are certain restrictions, certain ratios involved. The Fed says you can't put this money into the market. They even pay banks interest at about 4 to 4.5%, telling them to keep the money there and not put it in the market. Because if you do, inflation will skyrocket it. All right, Trump can't touch that because the Fed is independent, but he found a new way. And with this new way, he says to private banks, issue your own coins, issue your own stable coins. For example, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, they're all going to issue their own stable coins. What does it mean to issue a stable coin? You know how they have money sitting in their reserves that they can't use? They'll use that as collateral and start giving out loans to people through these coins. In other words, they'll start injecting money into the market to grow the economy. Trump says, look at the central bank. First, I'm going to change you. I'll never stop putting pressure on you. I'll also push you to lower interest rates using certain data. But you keep talking about monetary tightening. I've also figured out a way to solve that. Banks will be able to use the reserve money they hold for their members as collateral and flood the market with loans. What do you think of that idea? This way, money also flows into the market. Look, I want you to understand the genius of this plan. That's why they actually called the law about this the Genius Act. The Genius Law, or Law Genius, however you want to translate it into Turkish. And all the pieces of the plan are falling into place. On one hand, I increased the sale of Treasury bonds. I lowered their interest rates. I made things a bit easier for the government. At the same time, I found a way to inject the money held by the bank into the market. That way, money that would grow the economy also entered the market. But there's still one more leg to this. If the money entering the market suddenly goes straight to consumption, inflation will skyrocket because there'll be too much money in the market. If, on the other hand, products don't increase, services don't increase, if these don't become more abundant, inflation will occur. There will be more demand for the same amount of production. So they also need to manage this side of things. They have a plan for that as well. And in that plan, Bitcoin plays a particularly important role because they want people to keep a significant portion of their money in something like Bitcoin. The money you keep in Bitcoin doesn't enter the economy, so it doesn't create inflation. It just sits there as an asset. Of course, they want people to put some of it into gold, but the angel doesn't really like gold because gold isn't under their control. And on the other hand, maybe into areas like real estate. They want this money to go there so it can create economic growth without causing rapid inflation, because the worst thing is if it goes directly into consumption. In this context, they will also support Bitcoin. In the coming periods, we'll see the US government actively supporting Bitcoin. They'll do this through propaganda. And as you know, they've already declared Bitcoin as a reserve currency. They're going to buy Bitcoin themselves directly. That's the Bitcoin side of things. Why is the Ethereum side strong? Because whether stablecoins come from banks or all these stablecoins, whether from companies like Tether or others, mainly operate on the Ethereum blockchain. Ethereum's transaction volume is increasing and staking revenues are going up. So demand for Ethereum is rising in this situation. Since banks are becoming this integrated into the blockchain ecosystem, then why shouldn't solutions like XRP replace SWIFT? Look, this is basically the project. And of these, I believe 100% in the Bitcoin and Ethereum side. I believe about 80% in the XRP side. That's why my investment in XRP is obviously smaller, but I've already started. If this plan comes true, today's prices for cryptocurrencies will look like a joke. Because an insane amount of money will flow into the market, like, for example, through banks. Maybe $3.5 or $3.6 trillion will come into the stablecoin market. Let's say even just a tenth of that comes in, $350 billion, even that alone. That would push cryptocurrencies way up. And at the same time, stablecoins will spread throughout the market because people will quickly convert their paper assets into stablecoins and sell them. Of course, some of this excess stablecoin might go toward consumption or into other areas, but a portion of it will still be invested back into cryptocurrencies. This will definitely boost Bitcoin and Ethereum. It would also benefit XRP. Some altcoins would definitely gain as well, but I'm not claiming that all altcoins will go up, because these are what the government is focusing on. They've already explained this in their own strategic reserve documents. So there's really nothing secret about it. And right now, all the evidence for everything I've talked about is out there. I mean, the US Secretary of Services is saying that we're entering the golden age of crypto. The chairman of the US Securities and Exchange Commission is putting a 150 to 160 page regulation in front of us that strongly supports crypto. The Genius ACT has already passed through Congress. It got Trump's signature. Everything's fallen into place. And at the same time, they're creating personal wealth from this as well. For example, Donald Trump is buying an incredible amount of Bitcoin through different channels. His son is buying Bitcoin and Ethereum and basically shilling them. Right now, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Ludnick, has a company. Goldkinson Fitzgerald. He's buying a serious amount of Bitcoin and Ethereum. He's a partner in Coinbase in MacroStrategy, so their personal enrichment is happening through this as well. But of course, this doesn't mean the following, friends. The crypto market isn't going to explode tomorrow. It's not going to go straight up. We'll get shaken out along the way. There will be drops in between. But if America wants to overcome its economic troubles by growing, which I think is their only option left, the debt will become impossible to roll over any other way. The path to that is through this strategy. I can't say whether the strategy will succeed or not. They might get stuck on regulations, they might get stuck in Congress, lawsuits could be filed, a lot of things could go wrong. But this is the plan. And as long as this is the plan, I very clearly want to grow Bitcoin, Ethereum, and XRP. But there's another leg to the plan. They don't want to create inflation, right? One way to avoid creating inflation is to balance the inflow of money into the market a bit. Let them keep the ticket price in Bitcoin. We get it up to that point. But if they can't increase productivity, that's just a temporary solution. They need to boost productivity so that in return for the money they put into the market, we can put out an equal amount of more goods and services. And how do you solve that? It comes down to artificial intelligence and robots, because they're going to massively increase productivity. So in this context, the only thing I believe in is crypto right now. And when I say crypto, I'm talking about these 3 cryptocurrencies. I haven't analyzed them all. You likely know more about this than me. It's a complex world, and I truly believe in artificial intelligence. Because on the other hand, the salvation of the American government also depends on increasing productivity. You can be as clever as you want with monetary policies. You can engineer as many new financial products as you like. But if productivity isn't increasing in the real economy, it's all just a lie. And the place where that's going to happen is artificial intelligence. So that's basically my view. Within this framework, drops like the one we saw this Friday are always buying opportunities for me. We were already expecting this in August. We knew there could be some declines. That's how it is seasonally too. We already came up incredibly fast. Technically, a correction was needed. Maybe it will deepen a bit more. Because in election years, after the president is elected, August has always been rough. And there's quite a long history of this fact. So within this framework, it might drag on a bit longer. 50 lira is a super ID. So what's the move here? Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm just someone talking on YouTube after all. I can't give you investment advice. But even so, I'm still accumulating XRP, Bitcoin, and Ethereum. Now, I'm sure here, down in the comments section, there will be comments like, but sir, you didn't like Bitcoin back in the day. There will be stupid comments. I've always liked Bitcoin. What I didn't like was Bitcoin ending up in BlackRock's hands, because I knew things like this could happen. Bitcoin is no longer an independent currency. Bitcoin's not something decentralized anymore. Don't tell me otherwise. Its technology is centralized. All those arguments, I get them, because in the end, the ones who determine its value and regulation are the real owners of it. Right now, these things are coming under the control of the American government. The American government will use them to solve its own problems. China might make counter moves. Who knows what the Russians will do? But those are topics for other videos. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, a like would be awesome. Wishing you a great weekend. The you.